Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining us on today's webinar about a joint customer of ours from the U.S. Department of Defense and how it successfully deployed SAP Dynamic Authorization Management by NextLabs. Just a couple of housekeeping items to get out of the way here. All the lines have been muted, but feel free to submit your questions via the chat or the Q&A box that you see on your screen, because we've reserved some time at the tail end of the webinar to answer questions that have come in. So without further ado, I'm just going to dive right on in. My name is Norv Leong. I'm the Senior Director of Product Marketing here at NextLabs. I'm joined today by John Andrew Konis. He's the Technology Architecture Manager at Accenture Federal Services. And together, we're going to tag team today's webinar and hopefully keep this compelling enough that we don't put you guys to sleep. Here's a little sneak peek at what we'll be covering today. John's going to start off with a high-level summary of the specific challenges this DoD client faced and what its specific requirements were. And from there, we'll talk about the solution architecture that was adopted, the key technologies involved, and specifically the solution from NextLabs. We'll then segue into an overview of the benefits realized as well as the key lessons learned. Finally, we'll wrap it up with that Q&A session. So I'll pass the baton to John at this point. John, it's all you.
Thank you, Norv. So we started this journey with the DoD client a number of years ago, and the primary challenge that we were presented was to prevent unauthorized access to organizational data across the SAP landscape. So the client had looked at a number of solutions before and actually made an attempt to implement this prior, and that had not been successful. So for some of those reasons were that there weren't a lot of players in this space, and previously, I believe they had tried to move forward with an all-custom solution. And for those of you who have kind of worked in the SAP application security landscape, you may be familiar with the fact that there are organizational values that you can restrict transactions in the system by, but those aren't very consistent across all the transactions. And they needed a consistent way to restrict access from a master data level across the SAP landscape. And they needed that to be consistent and transparent to the user. So we came in and we looked at a number of different solutions. We looked at a number of different vendors. I think one of the primary reasons we ended up choosing NextLabs and going with them was because there weren't really many players in the space that had existing solutions that integrated well with SAP. A lot of our other options included heavy customization, or that would have been us specifically going in and doing all the customization ourselves, which would have left a very large burden on the client for maintenance after we leave or after the solution was implemented. So we initially did a proof of concept with NextLabs, proved that this would work for some of their most important transactions, and then moved forward from there. And some of the reasons that we did choose to move forward with them, other than the ones I mentioned previously, were that NextLabs presented better options to maintain, troubleshoot, audit. We had logs. You were able to validate policies much easier. It was a much more top-down, sort of transparent security model than some of the other options we had. As well, it layered nicely with our existing role-based access control, or ABAC model, that most people in the SAP space will already have very established processes for. So we were able to leverage that and use GRC, another SAP module, to do our role provisioning that included this attribute-based access control attributes, so the provisioning for those attributes. So those are some of the primary reasons, and we'll get into more details here in the next couple slides. So some of the key tenets that we wanted to maintain throughout our design, and things we were keeping in mind as we evaluated this problem for the client, was that we needed to partition all aspects of an end user's daily life. If we were only able to get 80% or take out major business processes, that would have left either a very large amount of burden on our support staff, who would have had to have higher level clearances or authorizations to perform those business processes on behalf of the organizations themselves, and that wasn't going to be cost effective. That wasn't going to be a tenable solution. We also needed to determine consistent and business disapproved methods to determine these organizational values when they weren't present in the system. So we ended up going with the fund center attribute. For those familiar with the public sector of SAP, it's a data element that stores the funding for different organizations to execute on. So that to us meant this is where the money's coming from, this is how we're going to partition the system. So we had to figure out how to determine that value throughout the application even when it wasn't present. And then one of our biggest challenges from a security perspective was allowing seamless navigation through the application. Again, if you've used SAP, you're familiar with all the different ways you can get to a given transaction. We have some diagrams later that will kind of give those who may not be familiar with it a kind of visual of what that's like. But there are a lot of different ways to view purchase orders or view different transactional data in the system, and we wanted to make sure we locked down all of those and provided a secure solution that didn't impact the users in any significantly tangible way. And then as well, on top of that, these clients, I know if you've worked with the public sector, I'm sure they've got lots of customized transactions, programs, functionality. We need to be able to, as Accenture, customize those for them, but keep that within the NextLabs solution. So extend their solution to support our custom programs and transactions. And that was another thing because they already had an existing SAP product, the dynamic authorization module, the DAM module. We were able to do that for them as well. And then lastly, these are 2 points that I talked about. Integration with GRC, that was a very big selling point. It allowed singular point of provisioning and role requests for the system, so both their organizational access as well as their action-based or transaction-based access, the RBAC access, in one point, and then a layered approach with the RBAC or the role-based access control model that they already had, instead of completely changing that framework. So those were very important tenets for us as we move to the next slide here. Sorry, my application restarted. One moment.
Do you want me to forward the slide for you, John?
It's coming back now. Yes, go ahead, North. Thank you.
Okay.
So as I talked about just a moment ago with the layered approach, this was a key element, and Norv, I know, will talk about this as he talks about some of the security frameworks that this attribute-based access control, or ABAC, is now being used for. But so you are likely familiar with the first 3 levels here in the diagram. The physical security, so either getting into a building, getting into a terminal, or getting into a computer, or being provisioned a computer, that would kind of be your physical access. A lot of the DoD clients also have like access cards and everything like that. The second level would be enrolled in SAP, so just being able to get access to that system and having an account there. And then level 3 is your traditional RBAC model, where you have specific transactions or reports that you can execute in the system. Now, traditionally, these are not restricted, and once you have access to, let's say you have access to create a purchase order, you'd be able to do that for any organization in the system. And there are absolutely organizationally based restrictions that SAP builds into their RBAC security, but provisioning those can be challenging because you'd need either an enabler role model where you have those organizational values assigned in a separate role, and then you get a transactional role assigned with that, or you'd have a derived role concept where you have 15 or 20 purchase order roles where they all have different organizational elements assigned to them. The challenge with that is it's basically impossible without significant customization to apply those consistently across an entire SAP framework with the tools available to you in an RBAC model. So that's where this ABAC and the NextLabs solution assisted us, and that was the 4th layer of security that we were able to add on.
And so, the solution has to start with a brief discussion or introduction on dynamic authorization. It's a technology whereby access rights to an organization's network, applications, data, and other sensitive assets are granted in real time via attribute-based rules and policies that John already alluded to. It externalizes access control decisions outside of applications, essentially separating policy management from the application lifecycle. So what this means is that you don't have to implement policies in each and every application itself, and you don't have to write new code every time you need to make a policy change. So dynamic authorization is the secret sauce, if you will, behind a policy engine that can dramatically simplify role management, in addition to allowing or denying access at the transaction or data level, all in real time. So, dynamic authorization, when it's paired with attribute-based access control, or ABAC for short, significantly streamlines this access management process. So the ABAC technology itself is spelled out in great detail in one of NIST guides, which is, you see in the upper right-hand corner, SP 800-162, which is the go-to reference guide for ABAC. So as you can see, there are several components to a dynamic authorization workflow with ABAC policies. So if you follow the little orange arrows in the diagram, you'll see that there are different points an authorization request must pass through before the user is ultimately allowed or denied access to a certain piece of data. You first start with an administrator creating policies, which are then stored in a repository from which user or file properties can be retrieved. And it's at this point a decision can be made as to whether access should be given or not. And the final step is the actual allowing or denying of access to the data in question. So what this diagram really boils down to is a policy-based approach that can sit alongside a role-based access control model, thereby preserving any prior investments made, if any, in an access control solution. So now, speaking of role-based access control, or RBAC for short, ABAC is the successor technology to RBAC. So with traditional RBAC, administrators need to constantly monitor and reassess changes in user status, reassign and revoke roles, or even monitor and reassign permissions on individual files or records. However, things get really complicated and messy the larger the organization from a management and cost standpoint. So ABAC, on the other hand, it introduces context when it comes to permitting or denying access to critical or sensitive data. It also provides much more flexibility than RBAC systems by looking at many other factors besides roles when making these access decisions. So on this slide, here you get a sense of the range of factors or attributes that are evaluated in authorization decisions. It can be grouped into buckets like subject, environment, and resource. These could include users, actions, devices, document types, geographic location, time of day, IP address, and a host of other factors. So here's an example of an ABAC policy. Say, to give it like a little defense industry perspective, you work at an aerospace company that builds products for the U.S. military. So you can have a policy that says, allow only directors with top secret clearance in the Special Forces Division, North American Theater, to access ITAR, classified data, and SAP ERP during working hours in, say, the Washington, D.C. office. Additionally, these directors can only view this data and not edit it. So, this policy that I just rattled off is pulling from several kinds of attributes to determine whether someone is authorized to access a certain piece of data. So as I mentioned previously, these attributes can be about citizenship, clearance level, department, project, device type, among many others. So basically, it allows you to set and enforce very granular policies, essentially spanning the who, what, when, where, and why of access control, which offers much more flexibility and scalability than RBAC-only systems. So John's now going to talk about how this technology was applied in our DoD client's specific case. John?
Sure. So we talked mainly high level here, but I think this is the best diagram to show some of the more specifics of the solution that we implemented. So as you see here, this is kind of a user level view of how the solution was implemented at this client. So ME53 is the view purchase requisition transaction for SAP. So a user might execute that. They might look for a specific purchase requisition. And then that's where this dynamic authorization management component that Norv was referring to comes in. So the policy enforcement happens there. They pull user attributes from the security classification table. Now that sometimes is stored at the policy controller depending on how you have some of your policies set up. Because ours pushed from GRC, which was a big selling point for us, we stored those in the security classification table, but that can be configured a number of different ways. So that you would pull the user's attributes, and then you'd go to the policy controller to have your policy determinations made there. So what happens there is, this is what Norv was referring to when he was talking about some of the ability to like write organization-specific policies and evaluate the attributes that were made in a specific transaction to determine whether or not a user has access or not. And then all that, those approvals and denials are logged and sent to the control center, as well as immediately sent back to the enforcement in SAP, where the user would then view the purchase requisition. Now, if they were fully approved, they may not see any difference. They may not notice anything. But if they had like a partial denial, for us, this meant that information would get redacted. So I might have access to line A, but not line B, or line 1 and not line 2. Or a full denial, and it would tell the user access to unauthorized information was restricted, and they would have to try again. So that's so as we move on here, the simplified, so what this allowed us to do was simplify identity management due to role reduction. So again, we didn't have to do any derived roles or any enabler roles that would make our role model extremely complex and make it challenging to maintain for administrators. And it simplified the access certification process as well. So our policies were very simple. We didn't have a lot of characteristics involved, and I'll speak about that in an upcoming slide. But essentially, it allowed the client to decide early on, what kind of policies they wanted to have, set those, and if they ever wanted to make changes, it was possible. But they didn't need to, reapply them throughout the system or reevaluate them in any other way than it fell into their normal process, right? So they didn't have to have a security administrator go in and send a report to the users of who has what access where. That was all understood and part of the framework. And then a very critical piece for this was also the certification of attributes. So the certification of attributes happened as a part of the standard GRC certifications. So every year the organizations go through and review who has access to what roles in the system, and that happens in GRC. So the organization roles on top of the existing transaction-based roles or the traditional ABAC framework, they would review both at the same time. So then they would get to see who had access to do what actions for them, but also who had access to perform those actions on behalf of what organizations. So they do those at the same time, which allows them to see exactly what a user could do for which organizations and for their organization, which was a critical piece. And then lastly, GRC had all of our segregation of duties as well, and that the integration with GRC was another key component to allow us to kind of centralize the SOD as well as the attribute-based component of it.
And then, just to pile on to what John just said, the real continuous authentication, risk-aware authorization, that's just another way to say, it's real-time contextual access control, reinforcing the scalability and flexibility that dynamic authorization with ABAC, brings to the table. And also, since these user attributes feature so prominently, it shouldn't come as a surprise that ABAC complements solutions from the identity and access management space, be it the privileged access management, single sign-on, or identity as a service players. When it comes to best practices, there are some key ones to consider as you roll out dynamic authorization implementations. And these can apply to both the public and private sector, by the way. First off, when it comes to attributes, it really boils down to quality, not quantity. And then, John will touch on this a little bit later too, but it's about being smart about how you create policies so you can take advantage of the flexibility and simplicity that attribute-based access control offers. So there are efficiencies to be had if you can apply a centralized set of policies across your key business processes. Less IT involvement means less administration headaches down the line. And not to be overlooked is the use of your metadata. With clean metadata, you're able to set very powerful policies with minimal ongoing administration. And for those of you that have already deployed an RBAC system, you can continue to leverage it even as you deploy an ABAC model alongside it. And finally, ABAC can be used to protect data as it sits in the application, as well as when it leaves the application as unstructured data, essentially providing end-to-end data protection. Now, you can even use dynamic authorization as a core piece of a company-wide security framework. It's a very powerful and sustainable framework because it assesses risk within a business context. You can think of the framework in 4 steps, going from left to right on your screen. First off, you've got to know your data, meaning you have to know what kind of data you've got, how valuable it is to you, where it's stored and managed, and what are the potential risks if that data is compromised. So you need to figure out what's your most sensitive data, how it's being used and shared, and if it's subject to any particular regulatory or corporate governance requirements. Now next, you've got to safeguard that data at the source. So I'm at the second box now. Seeing as how most data these days are generated by applications like SAP, it makes a lot of sense to focus your initial attention on safeguarding data at the source, to nip any potential problems in the bud. For instance, you can control which users are authorized to access what type of data inside SAP, such that not everyone can see all the data. And third, you need to persistently protect critical data on the move, and when it's shared with others, critical data is often extracted from the source application and shared as files or documents like PDFs, spreadsheets, and Word docs. Consequently, you need to ensure that that data continues to be properly protected even when shared outside of the application. And finally, you need to monitor, audit, and alert. This basically closes the loop from a compliance and governance perspective, since not doing so may expose you to penalties for violating any applicable compliance requirements. Now, when you plug in actual applications, directory services, and databases, the framework would look something like this. It includes identifying your data sources, whether structured or unstructured data, that's the left-hand side, as well as the attribute sources, that's the right-hand side, and then defining the policies that will be enforced throughout your network. And then you close the loop with monitoring and auditing for governance or compliance purposes, essentially making it an end-to-end framework for data protection and monitoring. And so that brings us to SAP, Dynamic Authorization Management. It enables the secure access to sensitive data across your business network. It features centralized authorization and data security policy management, virtual data segregation with view and field level data security controls, automated classification and tagging of sensitive data, as well as monitoring, auditing, and reporting capabilities for compliance purposes. So Jan is now going to talk about the value realized when you're deploying SAP DAM.
Thanks. So I've talked to some of these. I think this kind of like sums all of these benefits up together. So I'll kind of go through these a little quicker than some of the rest. But so again, one of the main efficiencies we got was the ability to enforce real-time all of these rules across the system and to do that consistently. That was the primary requirement. So this allowed us to do this extremely efficiently with almost no input other than organizations saying what users should have access to and shouldn't have access to. So that definition of the roles was something they were already doing or already aware of, who should have access to what. So NextLabs did the rest and made sure that the users only saw that information in the system. And it layered on top of our role-based model with some modifications to ensure that we were only provisioning users that had that were restricted transactions. So it was a very efficient model for us once put in place. And additionally, the risk mitigation component was obviously the primary requirement of the project. So ensuring that we protected the sensitive information and kept it visible to only those users who were responsible and authorized to view it. That was a key component. And then the improved cost reduction came along with the efficiency there. I think one of the components, and I'll talk about this a little bit in a minute as well, that was extremely important to us was to have a transparent and simple security solution. So, there was complexity in the design and build and test of this solution, but the maintenance of it overall is fairly straightforward. And I think a key component of that for us was having users understand how the security solution worked. So by reducing the number of roles, by reducing the number of layers and criteria with which a user might be restricted, we saw cost reductions not only from a security maintenance perspective, but also from a help desk perspective of users. We wanted to reduce the number of times a user enters a help desk ticket to have a support user go debug a session that was really just they didn't have access to that organization's information, and they needed to ask their supervisor why they didn't have that. So that's an add-on to the cost reduction is just how is the simplicity and transparency of the solution to the users. And then also the number of additional systems or integrations required with the DAM module already integrating nicely with SAP. And finally, the auditability and the ability to go in and look at the logs to see what users have and have not been accessing is helpful. I think for us many times those denials, so you might get a log that says the user was denied 100 times to accessing certain information, didn't necessarily mean that that user was trying to do something fraudulent or malicious. They may just have been running a report wide open and being rejected a number of times and seen redacted or reduced versions of that report. But that ability to see that and justify what kind of transactions they were running to generate those types of denials is an important component that the reporting aspect let us do. So this is kind of our takeaway slide, and the one I mentioned earlier about showing how the different access points to a transaction became a challenge for us. Absolutely, the most time-consuming and challenging part of the design and test of this solution was the restriction of the different access points to a different transaction. So kind of a little bit of SAP-specific speak here, but when you're accessing a purchase order, on that purchase order, you'll have an invoice and you'll have a goods receipt for that purchase order for the products that you were purchasing. And there may be many places to access either the goods receipt. You can go to pulling up that goods receipt document number. You can go to the purchase order and drill to it from there. I can get to the purchase order from that goods receipt. All I'm trying to say here is that there's a lot of different ways to get into these transactions, and users had familiarity with SAP prior to using the system. So if we were to have just closed all those doors and said, no, we're not going to allow any sort of navigation around and sort of back doors of these transactions, there would not have been adoption of the tool. They would not have used the new system. They would have been extremely frustrated, and we would have struggled to deploy this solution. So we had to lock down all those doors, and that required a great deal of testing. But I think what we ended up with was an extremely usable solution for the end user, and one that during our UAT and during our initial deployments, we saw that most of their concerns and their help desk tickets were not related to the security piece of the solution, which is a major accomplishment when the primary purpose of the system was for security. So the fact that we were able to implement this additional layer of security without significant user adoption challenges for that component, I think, is a big win. And then, so finally, and I think that kind of touches on the first 3 points there, and Norv was talking about this in the previous slide, for the number of attributes used for your policies. So again, a key tenet for us was transparency. It was a key tenet of us for our security model was transparency and simplicity. So we wanted to limit the number of attributes in the system that had an impact on the policy determinations that were made to as few as possible. So we used, as I mentioned, Fund Center, which is the PSSM product. So I know for those of you who are wondering, where's the public sector component of this? That Fund Center restriction based on the funding that the organizations had is that PSSM component. So the lockdown of all of the different access points to the transactions based on Fund Center is that piece. So that was the primary attribute. And then we also used transaction as well as the action a user was taking in the transaction or in the T code to apply different policies as well. So that was some things like users not having access to attachments or or editing attachments if they didn't have full access to the document. So certain things like that had different applications for the policy. We wanted those to kind of make sense intuitively. So by restricting the number of attributes, that gave us a better model for the users and for the administrators to maintain and understand. And I think I touched on this earlier, but I can't reiterate enough that if you have a security solution that is too complicated for the end users to understand, you're going to end up with a not very secure system, because the administrators will get frustrated and they'll start provisioning more access than they should, and you're not going to end up with the desired output. So that user adoption, having them understand the attribute-based access control model, our training made a big emphasis on that, because everyone's familiar with the role-based attribute access control. That framework's been around a long time. Anyone in the SAP environment is familiar with having to select those roles and being told which ones to pick. But the attribute-based access control is new, so that component was an important for us to train our users on. And then finally, and this is, I think, a question I saw pop up, attributes are managed in GRC. So we manage those organizational roles in GRC. The users select those organizational roles there. The approvers for those roles are based on those organizations. But then those push. So NextLabs had an API to the classification table. So those pushed to that table and maintained it from there. There's some data in there that remains static, but the majority of it was user attributes that were pushed from GRC. So that's how that maintenance occurred. So do's and don'ts, really talked about this. Make sure you're limiting your number of attributes that you're using in your policies. That will, pay you dividends later and give you a much more simplistic and transparent solution in the future. Make sure that you're educating your user base on what changes they can notice and where they need to reach out to for certain issues. One of the things that the decision we made early on was to make sure that we had a single error message in the system for those denials, those authorization or those organizational authorization denials, so that users knew if they saw that given message that this is why they were denied. And then, make sure that the security model is well documented. You have good graphics to kind of just display it. I think that's kind of an underrated component. I always learn better myself seeing visually, so I know that that bullseye has been a helpful slide to kind of communicate things to our stakeholders. So those are some of the products that we developed throughout the project to kind of help educate both our PMO on the client side as well as our users in the field. So Norv, I don't know if you have anything else that you want to touch on before we go into questions here.
No, I think you hit on all the salient points there, John. Thank you very much for that. And we've got a ton of questions that have come in, so I'm glad that you guys stuck around to the end. So if you can bear with us for an extra 5 minutes or so, because I know we're already past the bottom of the hour, we can address some of these questions. John, somebody asked, was this deployment to SAP only, or did it also include other feeder systems, such as contract writing, receipt and acceptance, and interfund?
So for us, this was just ECC for SAP. So we did not use it on the BW side. BW works differently. There were some components we were able to use on the standard side for that. So for us, it was just ECC and SAP.
Okay. Another question, what was the scope of the implementation from T-code/Fiori coverage?
So we are not on S4 yet, and we don't have Fiori apps. So this was just 277 standard transactions. This client does use a large number of the business processes. I know we covered HR, a lot of cost management, reimbursables, sales and distribution, funds management, finance. I'm probably forgetting one, but those were some of the major modules covered. And so, yeah, 277 transactions in there. It was a large scope of and materials management. I'm sorry, I forgot that one, asset accounting. So there was a large amount of functionality there. We tried to limit the number of transactions to some degree to how to do specific actions. Now that's something that I think a lot of customers and clients, especially with Fiori, are going to anyway, which is, giving people a more streamlined way to do a business process. So I think that actually aligned well with some of the long-term goals anyway, in that you don't want to give an end user 5 different ways to do something, because they will, and they'll find new ways to do it, new ways to break it. But we did roll out a large number of modules there.
Okay. Yet another question. Do these policies kick in at the application layer or directly in the database when the data is being fetched from the database, from the DB?
That's a good question. So they're at the application layer. So what happens is, let me see if I can go back, because I think this will help with the next question too. Let me go back to that slide with the SAP logo on it. There we go, went too far. So what happens is, and we were, this was actually an important component for us, so we wanted to make sure the data always came back in full, and then we were able to restrict it from there. This made troubleshooting much easier. This made, again, some of, I think, I know I keep reiterating it, but the importance of consistency with how you apply the security solution, we tried to apply both at the, from the functional level, at kind of the user-facing level, but also the technical level, because it made it much easier to support and maintain, both for NextLabs and for us, to be able to troubleshoot as, admins of the system. But it does, so essentially what happens is the transaction would prepare everything as if it was about to load the screen, and then things would be pulled from it. So if you can imagine just having, the simplest example is a report. It came back with 100 lines. If you only had access to 20 lines, you'd only see those 20 lines, and 80 lines would essentially be deleted at the application level so that you couldn't see them. And even if you went to like export or anything like that, those didn't show up either. It didn't show up there either. So it was kind of that last step at the application layer.
Got it. Well, somebody's asking a licensing question. What are the license options? I guess I can take this one real quickly. SAP DAM is a license, and then the public sector solution module that John talked about briefly is an add-on to SAP DAM. So those are the licensing options there. And if you happen to have other, SAP applications in your stack, this NextLabs solution can support S4HANA, Fiori, Advanced Planning Optimization, Business Warehouse, and several other SAP applications in addition to SAP ECC. And
I'm going to jump in here because Peter asked the question about what is PSSM, and I touched on it briefly. I don't know when the question was asked during the presentation, but that's why I went back to this slide as well. Okay. The PSSM are the specific implementations within SAP and SAP ECC in this case to restrict on Fund Center. So here in the diagram, when you execute ME53N, which is the view purchase requisition, it's those implementations specifically in the code that restrict the transaction on Fund Center. So that can be extended in the future. That's more of a NextLabs question. But essentially all those transactions, those 277 transactions that allowed the transactions to be locked down by Fund Center, that's what the PSSM is. So it's kind of a bolt-on that gives you that solution around Fund Center.
Okay. I don't know if you have visibility into that question that just came up in the last couple minutes, John, about are the policies coming into play at the kernel level in SAP?
Kernel level. I do not know. I'm not sure what that would mean. I know that's nothing we ever looked at from a design test perspective. So, yeah, sorry, I don't think I know enough to answer that question.
Okay. Yeah, I think for whoever asked that, we can get back to you on a more detailed answer for that. Does it mean we have to plug in the enhancements for every T code?
So the short answer there is yes. So these are, I mean, you have to put in those NextLabs policy enforcement. It ends up being like a commonly used function module that goes into existing enhancement points in the code. You have to put the breakpoints in there, right? You have to put the checks. If you remember
John, I think we lost you.
Oh, sorry, now I was on mute. So if you remember the diagram we had later on about the guards to the doors, and it kind of acts like that, where the office is the transaction and the guards are those NextLabs policy enforcement. It's like a function module that you place in the code, but you have to have some sort of check there, right? So it's not like scanning the application and looking for information. It's their enhancement points put in standard SAP customer enhancement spots that pull the attributes from the system at those points. And so the important piece there is that there's 277 transactions with those there that are pulling key attributes from those transactions. But probably going to have to stop at that level of the explanation, because I think further we'd need more of the NextLabs technical team members on to speak to where the future is there.
All right, and I think there's one final question that we didn't address. We kind of touched on it. What was the scope of the project with DoD? What business processes? The size of the population impacted?
So can't talk about all that. I know we talked about some of the business processes that were impacted in some of the modules. Yeah, I think I have to defer to, can't really expand too much more on what I already spoke to on that. I see the question coming in about managing so much customization in SAP. So for us, I mean, these are NextLabs managed implementations, so they're not custom. So that was, I don't know that I actually spoke in too much detail about that earlier, but that was a key point for the client, that they did not have to maintain those. So part of the licensing includes support for them, support for all those implementations. So, as Accenture, we could have implemented a lot of this solution, but we would have been then responsible for maintaining, and it didn't make sense to have this one-off solution that the client's then responsible for maintaining in perpetuity. So by having this, if we have issues, I think our the NextLabs team, like kind of project manager mentioned this, and we've experienced this to date, that once you get this in place and you've done thorough testing, you don't really have too much defects or issues over the time, and we haven't seen too many yet ourselves. But that said, it's the same SAP incident management process that it is you have for your existing SAP environment. So we log an OSS incident and we communicate with NextLabs through that portal. So that part of the support for it is very important, and that was an important part of how of the solution that the client wanted, was that they didn't want a custom solution to maintain. So that all of that maintenance and support is part of that licensing, or certainly was for us. I don't know, Nora, if you have more to speak on, but I would assume that would be the case for any future customers as well.
Right. Yeah. Well, we are way over time, and it's awesome to see so many people sticking around beyond the bottom of the hour, because I know this was only supposed to be 30 minutes, but tons of excellent questions. I forgot to mention that this webinar is being recorded, so we'll send you guys a link to the recording within the next couple days. So if there's anything that you missed or you wanted to review, you'll have an opportunity to look at that recording again. So many thanks to John Andrukonis for co-presenting with me on this. We hope that you guys found this a valuable use of your time. If you have any future questions, there was a slide that had both my email address as well as John's, so feel free to hit us up. So we hope to see you on future webinars, and I hope you guys have a great day and stay safe. Thank you, John.